Dan, you're such a freeloader. You get free room, free board, free medical care. When are you going to get a job? I'm pretty sure if I approached Dan in that way, to ask him to contribute a little bit more to the family household, I would not be met with very much success, would I? You're a cat. You don't care. Today and over the next couple of days, we're going to talk about conflict. And this is Module 4, Video 1. We're going to talk about some negative ways people handle conflict and also some ways that you can do a little bit better at handling conflict and maybe even avoiding conflict altogether. Let's talk about conflict a little bit. If I were in the classroom and I said, raise your hand if you think conflict is a good thing or a bad thing, I'd get a mixed response. In fact, conflict is neither good nor bad. The only thing about it that is good or bad is how you handle it. And I'm sure you've all had conflict with people that ended up in the deepening of your relationship. You actually got along better afterwards because it kind of cleared the air. But I'm also sure that many of you have experienced conflict that actually resulted in the demise of your relationship. And that, of course, is not good. In the book, there are a number of ways to handle conflict in a dysfunctional or unhealthy way, and also some suggestions for doing it in a healthy way. So let's get started talking about that. Before we do, though, one thing you want to ask yourself before we begin is how comfortable you are at dealing with conflict. Conflict is pretty unavoidable. And I think I mentioned in another video that in my husband's family, they handle conflict entirely different than I handle it. I don't have any particular fear of conflict. And a lot of things that I would not look at as being any kind of conflict, they might in fact look at that same thing and perceive it as a potential conflict and act accordingly. So it's kind of interesting to think about. All of this stuff is all tied together. Certainly conflict is tied into your listening skills. It's tied into whether you're a thinking versus feelings-oriented person, and a lot of the other things we've talked about already so far. So let's talk about dysfunctional conflict. I'm looking at page 70, I think, in the workbook, 70, 71, something like that. And the first thing that I listed on here was something called polarization. I'm sure you've all experienced this. Polarization is just the idea that you're always in a conflict, assuming that you are entirely correct and the other person is entirely wrong. This is obviously just going to make the conflict worse. It's much better if you do something called integrating, which is where you acknowledge that you don't agree on some points. You try to find common ground where you can agree a little bit, and maybe just agree to disagree. There are times, I know in my marriage, when my husband and I, we're not getting anywhere on something, we're just not speaking the same language or whatever, and we have to just go, well, we just have to agree to disagree, and then we abandon talking about it and move on with our lives. Some things we can't do that with, but a lot of things you can just kind of step away, and maybe in another couple of months you feel completely differently about it anyway. The next dysfunctional thing that people do when they're dealing with conflict is something called isolation. It's a little bit like polarization, except with isolation, it's more like you just don't want to give in just because of your ego. Like you just don't want to admit that the other person is right and you're wrong because you're afraid then they're going to have a one-up on you, and that's going to be bad for you in the future. That's not a very healthy way to be. It's much better if you coordinate and cooperate with each other and work together and admit that you're wrong if you're wrong. It doesn't hurt that much, really. Okay, another thing that people do when they're having an unhealthy conflict is something called coercion. This one's really bad, and coercion is usually some kind of threat. But the tricky part about it is that it might not be an actual outright threat. Like, if you do that, I'm going to do this. It might be something much more subtle than that becomes a pattern in your relationship where you just kind of know if you're having a conflict and you don't listen to what the other person says, that person is going to find a way to punish you, and it's like implied that that's going to happen. Let me give you an example of this. I knew a married couple, and the man had some health problems. In particular, he had diabetes. And he was kind of a controlling person, and so he was always trying to control the wife. And if she just said to him, no, look, I'm going to do what I want to do, he would not eat. And that would cause him to have very low blood sugar, which made him very sick, and sometimes really to the point of being very, very sick. And she would have to do what he said. You know, if she wanted to go out, he didn't want her to go out. He just wouldn't eat. He'd get real sick, and then she'd know that she couldn't leave. It was a very, very unhealthy pattern, kind of painful to watch, and I'm not sure what the solution for that was. I think they got marriage counseling. In that case, I don't think it worked. Well, it's much better if you agree to follow some rules of engagement when you're having a conflict. You know, I would bring it right out up front and say something like, look, I know this is what you're doing. I know you're trying to control me and punish me, but I have a right to my opinion, even if we don't disagree. So let's agree not to do these things. And you kind of come up with some ways of working around doing things that make the conflict worse. The next negative thing that people do when they're having a conflict is something called escalation. It's not one particular thing. It's basically anything that would make the conflict worse, like yelling at somebody, calling them names, kind of like I did with Dan in the beginning when, you know, I told him that he was lazy or a loser or whatever it was I said. It could include your nonverbal communication as well. I saw a very interesting video one time. It was by a man named John Gottman, who's a leading researcher in marital interpersonal skills. And it was this young couple who were on the verge of a divorce after about 5 years of marriage. They had a little kid, so they really didn't want to get divorced, but they couldn't get along. Well, this study actually put a camera on them, hooked them up to some devices that would measure how they were doing, like measure their pulse rate and blood pressure and things like that. And it didn't take very long for this couple to forget they had a camera on them and start fighting. And so they were arguing, they were talking at the same time and so on, and the woman was just standing there going like this. And the guy was like right up in her face, doing this, you're doing this, it's really pissing me off, all that kind of stuff. So after it was over, they showed the couple the videotape and asked them how they felt about it. And when they interviewed her, she said, you know, when he got that look on his face, it made me feel completely hopeless. Like nothing was ever going to work, and we were definitely on our way to divorce. He pretty much said the same thing about her. He said that he felt that she wasn't listening, she didn't care what he thought. And I don't think either of these things were really true, but that's how they came across, because they weren't controlling their nonverbal communication and they were escalating the situation. So how do you avoid this? Well, you need to de-escalate. If you find yourself getting a little bit riled, if you think that you're feeling a little sarcastic, your tone of voice is getting a little bit in your face, dial it back. Dial it back. In fact, try not to react in a negative way in the first place. This can be really, really hard when you're angry. I'm certainly not going to tell you I'm great at this. Everybody's natural reaction in a conflict is to be defensive, but it really pays off if you can stay calm and just listen and not do anything that's going to make it worse. The next dysfunctional thing that people do when they're in a conflict is something called drifting, and this simply means going off on tangents. A lot of times in a conflict, you might know the person is right, but you're mad about something else. So you start bringing that past history and, well, you did this. Or you just start talking about something that's completely unrelated to anything just to kind of gain more time to put up some kind of defense. I'll give you an example of this. I had a friend, this is many years ago, I had a friend who said something that really bothered me. And at first I was so angry about it, I just kind of decided not to do anything about it because I wanted to think about it. And after a few days I thought, well, I've been friends with her for many years and I don't want to lose that friendship. So I called her up and asked her if she would come over and talk to me. Well, she did. And I said, listen, I wanted to talk to you about what you said at the picnic the other day. It really bothered me because I don't think it's true. And she immediately launched into something about something else that I do that really makes her angry. So I did this. I actually said to her, okay, I didn't realize that bothered you, and I'd be happy to talk about that. But let's get back to this other thing. We'll talk about this first, and then we'll talk about the thing that I'm doing. Well, it worked. She actually said, yeah, okay, I'm really sorry I said that. I didn't mean to embarrass you. I know it's not true. And then we talked about the thing that I was doing that bothered her, and I apologized to her, and we're still friends many years later. So it really does work. Finally, the last item is short-sightedness. When you're short-sighted, it means that you, inside of a conflict, act in ways that make the other person feel like you really don't care whether the relationship is going to last. Like you really don't care if that other person just walks completely out of your life. And most of the time you're not really feeling that on the inside, but that's how you're acting. I think I said in one of the other videos that we had kind of a big family blowout a number of years ago. And when that happened, this relative of my husband came to my house and really told me off. And during that episode, which was very upsetting to both of us, honestly, because she was mad at things that I had done that I didn't even know I had done, she started calling me names. She called me the family bulldozer. It was very painful. And I felt like, wow, she really doesn't care about us. She just doesn't care about us at all. She doesn't care about whether we remain on good terms with her or not. And I thought she was being quite short-sighted. I'm sure she felt the same way about me and all the things that I had said to her that hurt her. So, you have to be a little bit fair about it and turn and look at your own behavior. I think it's much better in a conflict, though, to do the opposite, which is be foresighted and not say or do things that are going to damage the relationship to the extent that you will never, ever be able to get over it. I'm sure that's happened to most of us, and it's not good. You don't want to lose your close relationships with people. So a little bit of maturity and a little bit of control is definitely a much better option than acting in ways that you're going to regret later. In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit about styles that people adopt when they are dealing with conflict. Dan, honey, I need to talk to you for a second. Come up here. Come on. Okay. Listen, things are getting pretty tight around here, and I was wondering whether you would be willing to contribute to the household expenses. Maybe you could do a little bit of home defense to earn your keep. With these. Okay, sweetheart? Thank you, honey.